So when I work with front-end engineers and I ask them, okay, what do you think you need to become full stack? Well, the answer that I usually get is I need, databases. I need to know about databases, right? I need to know about microservices, right? I need to learn about doing, making APIs. I need to learn server deployments, right? So these are all great, but this is not really what you need to become full stack. What you need to become to full stack, if you're a front end engineer, is that here's what's happening, right? So let's in web development, front end engineering is part of web development. You have to think about it this way: web development is based on the foundation of client server architecture. What that means is that, let's say, in a very simple scenario, is that you have a web browser, right? That is, making a call to some sort of backend server, right? Conceptually, this is what happens, right? And so, as a front end engineer, what you're doing, your job, your task, your daily task, everything that you do, most of it, lives here, right? So this is where you are. This is where you are focused. And so everything that you're doing is what the browser, everything that you're doing is related to user experience on the browser, right? Interacting with the UI, displaying different visual elements, layout, all of these things are related to user experience. So if you want to transition into being full stack, which means you want to learn more or progress more towards this side of things, of course you need to know about databases. Of course you know how to do, APIs, which is nothing but the way you consume these services that are living on the server. Of course, you need to know how to deploy servers. But before you do any of that, you really need to understand, you have to have a mindset shift, which is before you were focusing on UX. Now you have to shift your focus from UX to AX. AX stands for application experience, right? Whereas before, you were focusing on user experience, right? What do I mean by application experience? Well, all this work that you've been doing here in the browser, right? In the browser, all this work is, creating and crafting these beautiful experiences for the user. However, who is the user interacting with? Well, the user is interacting with the browser. Yeah, fantastic, right? It's interacting with the browser. But what is it really interacting with? It's really interacting with an application that you built within the browser. This is what the user is interacting with, right? This app, let's call it app, a web application, a browser application, it's built with, in current landscape of things, it's with a React, with a Vue, with Angular, whatever framework you want. This application is what actually interacts with the server. So, as a front-ender, you've been busy with everything related to like this interaction of your application within the confines of the browser. How does it use browser APIs? How does it do different things? You've been busy also with a part of it, which is, making these API calls, these, HTTP calls to the backend. That's great. So now you have already been doing some of this. That's the good news. You've been doing some, let's say 30% of the application experience on the one side, right? So now when you move and you start to learn about server development or backend developments, the backend application does not know about the server. All it knows about is this. And so you want to start thinking more, how do we onboard? How do we integrate this application into the ecosystem? With that, when you start looking at these things, you start digging into things a little bit deeper, like HTTP protocols, like the different protocols that you use to interact between different systems. Things like security, right? Because once you onboard an application, like an application here, a front-end application, then you need to have to look at other considerations, not just, this type of security, but also this type of security. Is everything coming from this application legitimate? All right, can we trust everything from here? Is this application, behaving as a good citizen in our ecosystem? Right, so you need to start thinking about an ecosystem as a whole, rather than just being confined to this little thing, which is the browser. You start thinking about a system as a whole, right? Is this application a good citizen, right? Is it a good citizen? Is it making the right amount of HTTP calls, or is it abusing the HTTP quotas, right? How is this application, what's the place of it in this ecosystem? Is it deployed to a Kubernetes cluster, or is it, just running off a function or something like that? Or is it from CDN? What implication does it have? What implications, what services, when you start designing things like, okay, well, you already know what kind of, data that you need from the server, right? Here, when you're, designing your applications, your front-end applications, but is that feasible on the back end, right? Is there different ways that we can, optimize the rendering of this data? And so the returning of this data and the generation, aggregation of this data, right? So now you start to expand your thinking from UX, which is just the part that is dealing with the user. Think of it like the front end of a store, right? Now when you start moving into the back end, then your responsibilities are much greater, because you have to look at what's happening behind the scenes. And so this is something, that, most front-end engineers, because you don't know what you don't know, right? So this is why you follow tutorials like the Fullstack tutorial, right? Because, when you don't, when you're just busy building these, when you're just busy building these browser-based applications, everything I'm saying right now extends to, mobile development as well. You're building these browser applications. Everything you know about the backend is just the APIs. For you, the backend is an API. It's just a black box. I give an input via HTTP, I get output, right? But when you start looking at it from a application experience, you start looking at everything as a whole integrated system and all the implications. And this mindset forces you to look into all the topics that are related. And so I encourage you, as you move in, towards your as in this journey towards learning full stack development, is that you start looking at these things, like these topics that we mentioned today. Shift your mindset. That will help you to naturally being curious about all aspects related to, backend, front end, DevOps, everything across the stack.